Welcome to Rain Narrator channel where we take you on a journey of deep relaxation and complete tranquility with the sound of raindrops adding an atmosphere of tranquility and comfort. Relax, enjoy, and prepare to enter the world of dreams. If you are looking for an ideal way to relax or calm your mind before sleep, you are in the right place. Follow us to get the best stories. I met her in the most ordinary way. It was a cold afternoon in December, and the first snow of the year was falling in gentle, swirling flakes. I still remember the way she smiled when she looked at me for the first time. Her eyes a mix of curiosity and warmth. I had been lost in my own thoughts, staring out the window of the small cafe we both happened to be in, and when she entered, the light seemed to shift around her. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the way she moved through the room, so full of energy and life. We started talking that day, and we quickly became inseparable. I had always been a quiet, introverted person, but with her, I didn't feel the need to hide. It was as if she saw parts of me that I had forgotten about. We shared our thoughts, our dreams, our fears, and for once, I didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on me. With her, everything felt light, like we were two stars just barely touching in the vast sky, creating our own little universe. In the beginning, I did everything I could to show her how much she meant to me. I wanted her to know that I would always be there, that she was safe in my presence. I brought her flowers on days when the sky was gray. I listened to her when she needed to talk, even if she was just venting about the smallest things. I cooked her dinner on nights when she had long days at work, and I made sure to remind her how beautiful she was, even on the days she didn't feel it. But despite all the love I gave her, I started to notice small cracks. She began to pull away just a little, not enough for me to worry, but enough to make me question. At first, I thought it was just a phase, a busy time at work, maybe some personal issues she was dealing with. I didn't push her. I just kept being the person I had always been for her. She would smile and say she was fine, and I believed her. The more I tried, though, the more I felt like I was losing her in subtle ways. We would plan a night out, and she would cancel last minute, citing other commitments. She started spending more time with her friends, and when we did see each other, the conversations felt different, distant, like she was there, but not fully present. I asked her about it once, gently, not wanting to sound needy or demanding, but her answer was always the same: "I'm just busy." I accepted that, but somewhere deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the distance in her words. It was in the way her eyes would shift when I touched her, the way she'd pull away slightly when I tried to hold her hand. And then one evening I came to a realization. I walked into the cafe where we used to meet, the place where everything started, and there she was. But this time she wasn't alone. She was sitting with someone else. I didn't recognize him at first, just some guy with messy brown hair and an easy grin, sitting across from her as they laughed over a cup of coffee. My heart sank into my stomach. I stood there frozen. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't want to approach them, but something in me couldn't walk away. She didn't see me at first. Her back turned toward the door, and then when she finally noticed me, her smile was different. There was no excitement, no warmth. It was more of a polite, almost apologetic smile, like she wasn't sure how to act around me anymore. I didn't confront her. Then I turned and left the cafe without a word. The cold air outside felt sharp against my skin, but it wasn't the weather that made me shiver. It was the sudden realization that I wasn't the one she turned to for comfort anymore. The one I had always been to her, loving, patient, and kind, was no longer enough. Over the next few weeks, I saw her less and less. When I did see her, it was always with him, the man I had seen her with at the cafe. It felt like she was slipping further and further away, and all I could do was watch it happen. I wanted to scream at her, to ask why she was choosing someone else, but I didn't. I didn't feel like I had the right anymore. Maybe I had given her too much space, maybe I hadn't been enough. Eventually, she told me, after a long silence between us, that she felt like she needed something different, something I couldn't give her, and that was the hardest part. I had always believed that love was enough, that love, when given freely and with care, could heal anything. But she made it clear that love wasn't what she needed anymore. She wanted safety. She wanted someone who would provide her with the comfort of knowing that she wouldn't have to grow, that she wouldn't have to change. She wanted someone who was stable, who wouldn't ask her to step outside her comfort zone. And somewhere along the way, I had become someone who was asking her to grow, asking her to trust, to take risks, to love more deeply. And I don't blame her for it, not really. I understand now that what we had was beautiful in its own way, but not enough for her to stay. It's not that she didn't love me. I think she did in her own way, but it wasn't enough to keep her. And I think in some ways I wasn't enough for me either. I'll always remember the times we spent together. The way she would laugh at my silly jokes, the way we would talk about our hopes and dreams late into the night, our hands intertwined. But love, as I've come to learn, isn't just about showing up and being there. It's about being the right person at the right time. And sometimes we just aren't, and so I let her go. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I let her find her safety even if it wasn't with me. And as painful as it was, I knew that in the end, it was the only thing left to do. She found her peace and I'm learning to find mine. It's just a shame that it took me so long to realize that sometimes love is about knowing when to step aside, even when every part of you wants to hold on. It started as something simple, something pure. Her name was Emily, and from the moment I saw her, I knew my world would never be the same. I was just another guy at the university, struggling to find my way, my purpose. But she was different. She stood out like the brightest star in the sky. I never had the courage to talk to her at first, but when I finally did, it was like we were meant to be. I remember the first time we had a conversation. It was during a group project and I had to sit next to her. I was nervous, fumbling over my words, not knowing how to act. But she smiled, and that smile, it changed everything. We became friends, then something more. We'd walk through the campus together, talk for hours about our hopes and dreams, laugh about the small things. And in her presence, I felt like I was home. But love, real love, it's never as easy as we want it to be. I learned that the hard way. I started doing things I never thought I'd do. I sacrificed my time, my energy, and eventually my future plans. She needed help with her studies. I was there. She wanted someone to accompany her to an event. I was there. I put everything aside just to make sure she was happy. I was so lost in her that I didn't realize the changes I was making within myself, or how much I was sacrificing. I wasn't just giving up my time, I was giving up my independence. My dreams, everything that wants to find me. But that wasn't enough. No, it wasn't enough for her. I did everything for her. I even gave up the career path I had always dreamed of because it wasn't practical anymore, because it didn't fit into the world I was building for us. She didn't ask for that. She never asked for any of it. But I didn't care. I would have moved mountains for her. Then things started to change. She became distant at first. I thought it was just stress from school or maybe the weight of her responsibilities. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a phase, that everything would go back to normal, but it didn't. She started canceling our plans, not responding to my texts as quickly, and when we did talk, it felt different. I could sense a coldness in her voice, in her eyes. I couldn't figure out why I asked her, of course. I wanted to understand what was wrong, but she would just brush me off, saying it was nothing, that I was imagining things. And still I was blind to the truth. I thought maybe if I did more, if I gave more, she'd come back to me the way she once was. But then I found out. I overheard a conversation she had with her best friend. They were talking about me, about how much I had changed, how obsessed I had become. She didn't say it in a cruel way, but I heard the words and they stung like daggers. He's just too much. I can't breathe, she said. That's when it hit me. She wasn't in love with me anymore, if she ever was, in the way I thought. All those sacrifices, all those years spent dedicating myself to her, none of it had brought us closer. In fact, it had pushed her away. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to face, realizing that everything I had done had only made her want to leave me. And then I learned the worst part of all. She had started seeing someone else. I couldn't believe it at first. I didn't want to believe it. But when I pieced the clues together, the late-night texts, the secretive looks, the way she'd suddenly disappear to study, for hours at a time, I realized it was true. She had been in a secret relationship the entire time, while I was blindly giving everything I had to her, thinking I was the only one. The pain, it was unbearable. I had given up my future, my identity, my self-worth, all for someone who, in the end, didn't need me the way I needed her. She had found someone else who perhaps understood her in a way that I never could. And that crushed me. But still I couldn't let go. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she pulled away, I couldn't stop loving her. I kept telling myself it would be okay, that I could win her back. But she had made her choice. She chose him, someone who didn't have the same baggage I carried, someone who wasn't so wrapped up in her every word and action, someone who probably knew how to keep things light, to keep their own life intact while still being close to her. She didn't want my suffocating love. She wanted space. She wanted freedom. I was angry, frustrated, confused. I wanted to confront her, to scream at her, to demand answers. But I didn't, I couldn't. Because deep down I knew it was my fault. I had tried so hard to be everything for her. I forgot to be anything for myself. I watched as she slipped further and further away. I saw the smile she gave him, the way she lit up when he was around. It wasn't jealousy, it was grief. I wasn't angry at her, I was angry at myself. I had put her on a pedestal, made her my whole world. And I had forgotten that love isn't about losing yourself for someone else. Eventually I stopped reaching out, I had to. For my own sanity, I had to step away. But the scars remained. And when I looked at her in the halls, when I saw her happy with him, I could only wish that things had been different. Maybe if I had been stronger, if I had given her space instead of trying to consume her world, we could have been something more. But she made her choice, and I had to respect that, even if it destroyed me in the process. I learned the hard way that love isn't supposed to be a sacrifice of who you are. It's supposed to be an addition to the person you already are. And in my case, I had given up everything so blindly, so desperately, that I lost myself in the process. Maybe someday I'll learn to love again, but this time I'll do it differently. I'll be whole, and maybe, just maybe, she'll realize what she lost, or maybe she won't. But either way, it's not my battle to fight anymore. It all started when we were young, barely 16. I still remember the day we met, though it feels like a lifetime ago now. She was different from anyone I'd ever known, kind, bright-eyed, and full of dreams. Her name was Lila, and I think I fell for her the moment she smiled at me. We were at that age when everything felt bigger than it was, when a glance from her could make my heart race, and when a touch of her hand felt like it could change the world. We were inseparable in our little world. I was awkward and quiet back then, always a bit unsure of myself, but Lila was so different. She had this way of pulling people in, making everyone feel important. It wasn't just me. She had this infectious laughter, this unshakable confidence that could light up any room. I never felt like I belonged anywhere else more than I did with her. We spent our days in the park, walking through the streets, sharing secrets, and dreaming about a future that seemed so far away, but at the time, so certain. We spent summers lost in each other's company, every moment filled with magic. I would write her notes, dumb, teenage notes about the things we'd do, the places we'd go, and the life we'd build. And Lila, with her radiant smile, would take each one as though it was the most important thing in the world. I thought we were invincible, that nothing could come between us. But then came the trip. She went away for the first time without me, just a little break with her family. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself, it's just a few days. She'll be back. But something shifted in her when she came back. She came back with stories about someone she'd met on her trip. His name was Daniel. At first it wasn't anything serious. She'd mention him casually, talking about the conversations they'd had, the places they'd gone. And me? I smiled and nodded, tried to keep my jealousy in check. I mean, I trusted her, right? She wouldn't betray me, but a part of me deep inside started to feel that something was off. She seemed different, more distant in a way, more focused on her own life outside of ours. I kept telling myself it was just a phase. People meet new people all the time. It didn't mean anything. But slowly, the conversations between us started to change. She spent more time with Daniel, talking about his interests, his dreams, his plans. And each time she spoke about him, I felt a tightening in my chest. I didn't understand it at first, but the feeling of being replaced, of being forgotten, was like a slow poison. I tried to be patient, to be understanding, but it hurt. It hurt to see her pull away when just months before I was the only one who mattered to her. It felt like I was losing her piece by piece. I remember the first time she said his name, with that glint in her eye, like she was in awe of him. Then came the night it all changed. I called her, just wanting to hear her voice, to remind her of the bond we shared. But when she picked up, I heard a background noise I hadn't heard before. There were voices, laughter, Too many voices for it to be a casual get-together. It was a party, and there he was, Daniel, laughing with her in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. It was that I felt this pang of betrayal deep in my gut. I tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed it off, saying I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I could feel something changing, something shifting that I couldn't control. The weeks after that night felt like I was losing her more and more. We started drifting, the gaps between our conversations widening. She'd be on the phone with him for hours while I sat in silence, waiting for her to look at me like she used to. She'd talk about his trips, his ambitions, his adventures, and I'd just sit there, a quiet spectator in the background of her life. And then one evening, she told me something that would haunt me for a long time. "I think I need space," she said, her voice distant, almost cold. "I'm just not sure about us anymore." I froze. Space, that was the word that shattered everything. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix what was breaking. It felt like I was grasping at sand, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through my fingers. "You're sure?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, eyes avoiding mine. "I'm sorry. I really am, but I think I've changed. I think we've changed." The pain was unbearable, like a knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen. But what hurt even more was the truth behind it. She had changed, and she wasn't the same person who had laughed and shared dreams with me under the stars. It took me a while to accept it, but eventually I realized that she had chosen him. She'd fallen for someone new, someone who could give her the things I couldn't, someone who wasn't stuck in the past with her, and I was just the one she left behind, a casualty of her growing up, her moving on. For months I tried to keep myself busy. I threw myself into school, into my work, into anything that would keep my mind off the fact that Lila was no longer mine. I didn't hate her. I could never hate her. But I resented her, resented the way she had treated me, the way she had betrayed me without a second thought. And it was hard not to feel bitter about the fact that I had been replaced so easily. She had found someone else, someone new, while I was left holding on to the pieces of something that had already fallen apart. It's funny how life works. The love we shared, so intense and pure at one point, had been erased with a few words, with a few actions that could never be undone. But in the end, I had to let go. I had to let her move on, because holding on to something that wasn't there anymore wasn't going to bring her back. I don't know where she is now or what she's doing, but I know that I'll never forget her. Lila was my first love, and even if she hurt me in ways I'll never fully heal from, she taught me about love, about trust, and about betrayal. And as painful as it was, I know that it shaped me into who I am today. So here I am, telling you my story. Because despite everything, love doesn't fade. It doesn't go away. It just changes. It turns into memories. Memories that you'll carry with you forever, whether you want to or not. I've always trusted her. From the very first moment we met, it felt like I had known her forever. There was something about the way she smiled, the way she spoke, and the way she listened that made me feel completely seen, as if I was the only person in the world that mattered when she was around. My friends would joke about how she was the one for me, and I couldn't help but believe them. I couldn't help but believe in us. We were young, maybe too young, but our connection felt real, like it wasn't something we could just walk away from. In the small, quiet town we lived in, we spent hours together, walking down dirt roads, talking about everything and nothing. And there was this comfort between us, this understanding, as if our souls were perfectly aligned. But life has a way of changing things. We were 18 when I realized she was pulling away. At first it was subtle, little things, like how our conversation started to drift, or how she would cancel plans at the last minute. I didn't think much of it. We were both figuring things out, right? I had this unwavering trust in her. She had always been so strong, so independent. Maybe she just needed space. But soon enough, I found out she was seeing someone else. It hit me hard, but I still didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face the truth, even when people started talking. I remember the day I heard it from a friend. It was as if the world had come crashing down on me. It didn't make sense. We were perfect, weren't we? When I asked her about it, her eyes, those eyes I had trusted with every part of me, seemed to avoid mine. She wasn't lying, not directly, but I could tell. She was ashamed maybe, but not in the way I had expected. She didn't have to explain. but I could see the weight of her decisions pressing on her. She told me she had to do it, that the pressure from her family, the financial strain, the fear of the future, it all had been too much for her. She said she was trying to do what was best for her, and that's where I lost her, I think. Or maybe she was already lost by then. I could see it in her face. The doubt, the uncertainty. It wasn't that I didn't understand. Life had a way of pushing people in directions they didn't want to go, making them choose between what they loved and what they thought they needed. I knew that pressure all too well, but I also knew what we had. It wasn't just a summer fling or a young crush. What we had was real, or at least I believed it was. She told me she needed time to figure things out, that she wasn't sure where we stood anymore, that everything had changed, and maybe it had, but I couldn't understand how someone I had shared everything with, the first kiss, the late night talks, the dreams for the future, could suddenly be so distant. Could she just walk away from us so easily? Did I mean nothing? I stayed silent after that conversation, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't know how to say it. How could I tell her I would wait forever for her, even if she was with someone else? How could I admit that I couldn't imagine my life without her in it? No matter how much she had pulled away, so I did what I thought was best. I let her go. But letting go didn't mean moving on. It didn't mean healing. I was still there, stuck in that place between hope and despair, waiting for her to come back to me. She didn't. She was with him now, that other guy, and I couldn't bring myself to ask her if she loved him the way she had loved me. Was it the same? Or was it just the pressures of life, the fear of being alone that had led her into his arms? I think about her sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts. I wonder if she's happy, if she's still struggling like she did before. I wonder if the weight of everything is still too much for her. She was always so strong, but sometimes strength isn't enough when you're carrying too much. I wonder if she regrets it, if she ever misses me the way I miss her. I could have fought harder for her, I suppose. I could have stood by her side, told her we could work through it together. But I also knew she was a person who needed to make her own choices, even if those choices broke me. Life hasn't been the same without her. I still trust her, even though I'm not sure if she'll ever come back. And maybe she won't. Maybe she'll find a life with him, a life where I'm just a distant memory. But I'll always trust her because that's who I am. I trusted her when things were easy, and I'll trust her even now, when things have gotten so much harder. I hope she's okay. I hope she finds the peace she's looking for, even if it's not with me. And I hope one day, when she looks back on everything we shared, she'll remember that I was the one who loved her completely, even when life got in the way. As for me, I've learned something important through all of this. I've learned that love isn't always enough, not when the world asks too much of you. But maybe, just maybe, love can still be a quiet promise that lasts forever, even if the two people who made it can't be together. She told me she needed time to figure things out, that she wasn't sure where we stood anymore, that everything had changed, and maybe it had, but I couldn't understand how someone I had shared everything with, the first kiss, the late night talks, the dreams for the future, could suddenly be so distant. Could she just walk away from us so easily? Did I mean nothing? I stayed silent after that conversation, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't know how to say it. How could I tell her I would wait forever for her, even if she was with someone else? How could I admit that I couldn't imagine my life without her in it? No matter how much she had pulled away, so I did what I thought was best. I let her go. But letting go didn't mean moving on. It didn't mean healing. I was still there, stuck in that place between hope and despair, waiting for her to come back to me. She didn't. She was with him now, that other guy, and I couldn't bring myself to ask her if she loved him the way she had loved me. Was it the same? Or was it just the pressures of life, the fear of being alone that had led her into his arms? I think about her sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts. I wonder if she's happy, if she's still struggling like she did before. I wonder if the weight of everything is still too much for her. She was always so strong, but sometimes strength isn't enough when you're carrying too much. I wonder if she regrets it, if she ever misses me the way I miss her. I could have fought harder for her, I suppose. I could have stood by her side, told her we could work through it together. But I also knew she was a person who needed to make her own choices, even if those choices broke me. Life hasn't been the same without her. I still trust her, even though I'm not sure if she'll ever come back. And maybe she won't. Maybe she'll find a life with him. A life where I'm just a distant memory. But I'll always trust her because that's who I am. I trusted her when things were easy, and I'll trust her even now. When things have gotten so much harder, I hope she's okay. I hope she finds the peace she's looking for, even if it's not with me. And I hope one day, when she looks back on everything we shared, she'll remember that I was the one who loved her completely, even when life got in the way. As for me, I've learned something important through all of this. I've learned that love isn't always enough, not when the world asks too much of you, but maybe, just maybe, love can still be a quiet promise that lasts forever, even if the two people who made it can't be together. It all started when I first saw her. I was walking through the park just another day, the air crisp and cool. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. That's when she appeared, sitting by the fountain, her eyes locked on the water. She had long, dark hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, and a smile that could light up the world. I had never seen anyone like her. She looked so peaceful, so untouched by the chaos of the world. I didn't know why I walked over to her. I didn't know what possessed me to strike up a conversation, but I did. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky, but I couldn't take it back. "What are you thinking about?" She looked up, and for a moment, I was sure she was going to ignore me, but then she smiled. "Just the way the water reflects the sky. It's beautiful, isn't it?" Her voice was soft, melodic, and I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in years. We talked for hours, exchanging stories, laughs, and bits of ourselves. By the time we parted, I felt like I knew her, like we had always been meant to meet. Her name was Emily, and from that moment on, she was all I could think about. The growth of love. Days turned into weeks, and we saw each other more and more. It was like a dream I never wanted to end. We would meet in the park, or sometimes in the little coffee shop by the river. She always had that same light in her eyes, that same quiet beauty. We would talk about everything, our childhoods, our hopes for the future, even our darkest fears. With Emily, I was never afraid to be myself. She made me feel like I mattered. She told me she had a complicated past, that she had been hurt before, and because of that, she was careful about who she trusted. I understood that. I didn't push her to open up. In time, I thought she'd let me in completely, and she did. Slowly but surely, she became the center of my world. I was in love with her, no doubt about it. She made me feel like I was the only person who truly understood her. The change, but then things began to shift. Little things at first. She would cancel plans at the last minute, sometimes with a vague excuse, sometimes with nothing at all. I didn't think much of it at first. Life gets busy, right? We all have our ups and downs. But as the days passed, the excuses piled up. And when I tried to reach out, she seemed distant, distracted. I'd call her, text her, but she wouldn't respond. When we did talk, she would be evasive. Her answers clipped, her laughter less genuine. I thought it was just a phase. Maybe she was going through something she didn't want to share yet. I tried to be patient, tried to be understanding. I loved her after all, and I knew that love meant waiting, right? But then one day I showed up at her apartment unannounced. I had a feeling something wasn't right. It had been days since I'd seen her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. The betrayal. She opened the door, looking surprised to see me, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Or something worse? "Emily, where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. She looked at me for a moment, and then it happened. She took a step back, away from the door. I think we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What's going on, Emily? What's happening?" Her eyes darted away as if she couldn't meet my gaze. I've been seeing someone else." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what she was saying. "What? No, that's not possible." But she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did, and I can't keep lying to you." I stood there, frozen. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand why. But I couldn't, my heart was too shattered. I had given her everything. And now in the blink of an eye, it felt like it had all been a lie. I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, "but the damage was done." She had already hurt me more than she could possibly understand. The aftermath. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't know how to cope. I tried to talk to her again, to understand why she had done it, why she had betrayed me like that. But she couldn't give me an answer that made sense. She was sorry, but she had already made her choice. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't do anything but replay the moment over and over in my head. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have seen the signs? Maybe deep down I knew. Maybe there was a part of me that saw the distance in her eyes, heard the cracks in her voice. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the woman I loved had used me as a temporary placeholder until something better came along. I thought I could move on, but the wound she left was deep. Every time I saw something that reminded me of her, a song we used to listen to, the smell of her perfume on someone else, it felt like a fresh cut. And I hated myself for not seeing it coming, for not seeing the truth sooner, the realization. Months passed and the pain eventually dulled, but it never completely went away. I learned to live with it. And in a way, I think that's the worst part of betrayal. It doesn't go away. You just learn to live with the emptiness. I was angry, heartbroken, and confused. But over time, I realized something. It wasn't me. It wasn't my fault. Emily's choices were hers to make. She was the one who chose to betray me. I loved her. But love doesn't mean you have to accept someone else's lies. I had to let her go, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I don't know if she ever truly loved me. I don't know if she ever felt the same way I did. What I do know is that I learned something important from all of it. Love is fragile. People change. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't stop them from hurting you. And so here I am, still healing, still learning, but I'll never forget her. Not completely. Because even in the pain, there were moments of true love, moments that will always be a part of me, but I won't make the same mistake again. I've learned my lesson and I'll move forward, even if it means leaving her behind. It was one of those mornings where everything felt fresh, like the world had just woken up from a long, peaceful sleep. I was standing at the edge of a crowded marketplace, the kind that's always buzzing with life, sellers shouting prices, children darting between legs, and a light breeze that carried the scent of spices and something sweet. It was the perfect moment to be lost in a foreign place, but there she was, standing just a few feet away, looking at an antique vase that seemed far too expensive for the poor, cracked roads we were on. I had been traveling for a few days, exploring the sights, just trying to clear my head, trying to escape the monotony of my everyday life. I didn't expect to meet someone like her. She had this look in her eyes like she was seeing the world in a way that most people didn't. And when she caught me staring, because I wasn't exactly hiding it, she smiled. It wasn't a polite, fleeting smile. No, it was something genuine. Something warm that made the space between us feel a little less strange. "I thought you were going to buy that vase," she said, teasing. But there was something curious in her voice. "It's beautiful, don't you think?" I chuckled, feeling like an awkward teenager caught in the act of admiration. "I don't think I can afford it," I replied. "But you're right, it is beautiful." Her eyes lit up. "I'm sure you could work out a deal if you really wanted it." I shook my head, but I couldn't help but laugh. "Maybe, but I'm not that good at negotiating." "Not yet, anyway." "Then I guess you're stuck without it," she said with a playful shrug. "But that's the fun of traveling, right? Seeing things you can't always have." There was something so easy about talking to her. She wasn't trying to be anyone else, wasn't pretending to know more than she did. She was just her. And for some reason, it felt like I'd known her longer than I really had. We ended up walking together through the rest of the market, talking about everything and nothing. She told me her name was Emma, that she was from a small town near the coast, and that she was here because she needed a change of scenery. I told her about my life in the city, how I worked at a small marketing firm, how I spent too many hours staring at a screen and not enough time doing something that actually made me feel alive. And here's the funny thing, I wasn't looking for love. I didn't think I needed it. But with Emma, everything felt different. The way she looked at the world, the way she made me laugh at things that usually annoyed me. It was like I was seeing a new side of myself, the side that was adventurous, the side that wasn't afraid to let go. When the day ended and the sun began to dip below the horizon, we exchanged numbers. Nothing dramatic, no promises or declarations. Just a simple, "it was nice meeting you," and a smile that told me, deep down, we both knew this wasn't the end of our story. The next few days were a blur of messages, photos, and long phone calls. We explored the city together, visited museums, ate street food, and wandered aimlessly through places neither of us knew. There was this perfect sense of being in the moment with her. No expectations, just the two of us making the most of whatever we had. But it wasn't until the last day of our trip that I found out something that made my heart skip a beat. We were sitting in a quiet cafe, our bags packed, preparing to head in opposite directions, when she dropped the bombshell. "I have to tell you something," she said, fidgeting with her cup. "I think you're going to laugh, but I think we might live in the same city." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I live in your city. I've lived there for the last couple of years." I don't know why it took me this long to tell you, but I interrupted her with a laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "No way, I'm serious. I live there too." We both stared at each other for a moment, the silence hanging in the air. Then, like something out of a movie, we both started laughing. It was ridiculous, but it was perfect. We had met halfway across the world, in a completely different city, and now we were realizing that we lived just a few miles from each other. It didn't make sense, but in a strange way, it felt like the universe had planned it all along. We spent the next few hours walking around, talking about everything, how we could meet again when we got back home, what our lives were like outside of the tourist attractions. It was like a secret bond had been formed between us, something unspoken but deeply felt. When it was time for us to leave, we promised to stay in touch. It wasn't a big, grand moment. It didn't need to be, but I knew something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't ignore. Back home, life resumed its usual pace. I went back to my office job, went out with friends, tried to keep my head above water, but all I could think about was Emma. I couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was waiting for me. And then one evening, when I least expected it, I saw her standing outside a cafe on the street corner near my apartment. It was one of those moments where time seems to slow down, where everything feels surreal, but all I could do was smile. "You found me," I said, my heart racing. "I told you I'd find you," she said, grinning back at me. "You didn't think I was going to let you get away that easily, did you?" From that moment on, our connection only deepened. We spent weekends together, exploring the parts of the city we had never noticed before, sharing meals and just being present with each other. It wasn't always perfect. There were moments of doubt, moments where we wondered if this was just a temporary spark. But every time I looked at her, I knew I wasn't going to let this slip away. Love, I've come to realize, doesn't always announce itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it starts in the smallest moments. The way someone looks at you, when they don't think you're paying attention. The way they laugh at something silly. The way they make you feel like you're the most important person in the room. For me, it started in a marketplace far from home, and it's been growing ever since. And now, as I sit here and tell you this story, I can't help but smile. Because love is still new for us, still unfolding, still surprising us every day. But I know one thing for sure, I'm not letting her go. It all started when I walked into the office that morning. The usual hum of the place, the rustling of papers, the clicking of keyboards, and the familiar smell of coffee filled the air. But that day, something was different. A new team member had just been assigned to our department. As I looked around, my eyes locked onto her, Emily. She was seated at a desk near mine, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, focused intently on her computer screen, her brows furrowed as if she was already tackling the most challenging task. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my life was about to change. At first, I was too shy to approach her. After all, I had just started getting my feet under me in this job, and the idea of working with a stranger, let alone talking to her, seemed a bit intimidating. But fate had other plans. Our manager, Sarah, announced one afternoon that we would be paired up for an important project. It was a new client we were working with, and their requirements were complicated, to say the least. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and dread when Sarah said my name and paired me with Emily. She was new, and I was still learning the ropes, so I was worried about how it would all go. But when I sat down next to her to discuss the project, I noticed how calm and confident she was. She greeted me with a warm smile, and for some reason, that instantly put me at ease. We went over the project details, and Emily took the lead. guiding me through what we needed to do. Her approach was practical yet creative, and I admired how she handled every task. Her attention to detail was something I lacked, but I had this overwhelming desire to learn from her. At first, we didn't talk much beyond the project. We exchanged ideas, worked late into the evenings, and the more time we spent together, the more I realized how incredible she was. Her work ethic was contagious, and her sense of humor made even the most stressful moments enjoyable. There were these moments when our eyes would meet across the table, and she'd give me a quick smile or a nod of approval. I knew that she saw the effort I was putting in, and I could feel myself starting to care about more than just the project. One evening, as we stayed late to wrap things up before a big presentation, Emily leaned back in her chair and stretched. She laughed and said, "I think we're going to need a lot of coffee to get through tomorrow." I couldn't help but laugh with her. There was something about her, something about the way she saw the world, that made everything feel brighter. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'll need 3 cups just to get through the morning," I said, half joking, but we both knew the pressure was on. "Don't worry," she said with a wink. "I'll make sure we both get through it. I'm pretty good at handling pressure." I couldn't help but admire her confidence. But what I didn't expect was that after a few moments of comfortable silence, Emily turned to me and said something that I never forgot. "You know, I'm really glad we're working together. I've been wanting to be on a project like this for a while, but it's nice to have someone who's so easy to work with." My heart skipped a beat. I had never thought of myself as someone easy to work with, but hearing it from her made me feel like I was on top of the world. We spent the rest of the night talking about the project, our lives outside work, our shared interests, and for the first time, I realized just how much I enjoyed being around her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and late nights. But through it all, Emily and I found a rhythm. We complemented each other perfectly. She brought a level of organization and meticulousness that I often lacked, and I provided a more spontaneous and big-picture approach. Together, we created something that even our manager was impressed with. The client was thrilled, and Emily and I shared a quiet moment of celebration when we received the final approval. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere between the late nights, the laughter, and the teamwork, I started to realize that I had developed feelings for her. It wasn't just her intelligence or her work ethic that drew me in, though those things certainly mattered. It was the way she cared about the work, about the people around her, and about me. She made me want to be a better person, a better version of myself. One Friday afternoon, when the project had been successfully wrapped up, and we were finally able to take a breather, Emily and I were sitting outside the office, enjoying the first signs of spring. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over everything, and I could hear the soft hum of the city around us. "You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I'm really going to miss working on this project with you." I felt a pang in my chest. I didn't want our collaboration to end either. But before I could respond, she turned to me with that same smile I had grown so fond of. "You've been great to work with, really. I think this is the start of something good, don't you think?" she asked, almost as if she already knew what was on my mind. And in that moment, I realized that we weren't just colleagues anymore. We were something more. I nodded, my heart racing. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think this is just the beginning." From that day on, things changed. Our relationship, though still grounded in professional respect, deepened. We began to spend more time together outside of work, going for coffee, taking walks, and talking about everything under the sun. It wasn't long before I found myself completely in love with her. But I was terrified of ruining what we had, terrified that my feelings might not be returned. But Emily, with her usual warmth, made the first move. One evening, as we were walking out of the office together, she stopped me. "Hey," she said, looking at me with those beautiful eyes of hers. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you. I think I'm falling for you." My heart leaped into my throat. All the worries, all the fears melted away in that instant. I took her hands in mine and said, "I've been feeling the same way." We stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, the world around us fading away as I realized that this was it. This was what I had been waiting for, love. The next year was full of new experiences, growing together, both personally and professionally, and eventually, when we both felt the timing was right, I asked her the most important question of my life. "Emily," I said, holding her hand, "will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. Yes, 1,000 times yes. And just like that, the girl I met at work, the one I had admired from afar, became the love of my life. We built our future together, and every day I'm thankful for the project that brought us together, and the love that grew out of it. We worked side by side, built a life together, and found that love isn't just something that happens. It's something you build bit by bit, moment by moment. And ours was a love story written between the lines of spreadsheets, coffee breaks, and late-night talks. The best story I'll ever tell. It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw her. I had been to that cafe 100 times before, sitting by the same window, the one where I could watch the world outside, feeling a little detached from it. I liked the routine. I liked the solitude. I remember that day clearly. The kind of cold, steady rain that makes everything outside look like a dream. Soft and blurred, but with a sharp bite. I was nursing my usual black coffee. No sugar. My thoughts adrift on whatever book I was pretending to read. I wasn't looking for anything, really. Life had felt like it was running at its own pace, too fast for me to catch up. I just wanted a quiet moment, a chance to breathe. Then she walked in. The door chimes rang, and I didn't look up immediately. But when I did, I saw her standing in the doorway, shaking off the rain from her coat. She was the kind of person who would stand still for a second, as if making sure the storm wasn't going to follow her inside. She wore a dark green scarf that looked so soft, a little like the color of autumn leaves. Her hair, dark like a storm cloud, was caught in the soft breeze from the door, and there was something almost ethereal about the way she moved, like she was part of the atmosphere rather than the cafe. She ordered a cappuccino and sat a couple of tables away from me. I tried to focus back on my book, but the world had changed. I didn't want to admit it, but my attention had shifted. I felt something tug inside me, like I was aware of her without really knowing her. I caught myself watching her just for a moment. She was reading a book too, but it wasn't the kind of book you'd expect in a cafe. It wasn't some best-selling novel or a self-help thing. It was a thick, old hardcover with pages that looked well-loved. I found myself wondering about her life. What made her pick that book? Why this cafe? Why today? That's when the most ridiculous thing happened. I sneezed loudly like a complete idiot. And of course, she looked up from her book at the exact moment, catching me mid-sneeze. My face burned. She smiled, a little amused, and then her eyes went back to her book. But I couldn't go back to my own. I sat there awkwardly, shifting in my seat, wondering if I should say something. Anything to make the moment less strange. But she wasn't looking at me anymore. So maybe I could just sit quietly and pretend nothing happened. But then, because apparently I had no control over myself, I stood up. I don't know why I did it, but I did. My heart raced as I approached her table. I almost turned around, but I didn't. When I reached her, I blurted out something stupid. Sorry about the sneeze. She looked up at me with those warm, brown eyes that immediately softened, like she had already forgiven me for being a total mess. Her smile was shy, but there was something comforting in it. She put the book down on the table, making space for me. "It's fine," she said. "I've had worse. One time, I sneezed in the middle of a job interview." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How did that go?" Her eyes twinkled, and she leaned in a little. "Well, the interview was fine. But the sneeze. Let's just say it didn't help my chances with my nose running everywhere." I laughed. It felt natural, easy. I didn't laugh much these days. But her laughter was like a key unlocking something inside. Me I had forgotten was there. "Do you always have such disastrous encounters?" I asked, still smiling, leaning casually against the back of her chair. She shrugged. "Only when I'm feeling particularly unlucky." Something about her answer told me she wasn't as unlucky as she claimed. It wasn't just a casual remark. There was a hidden layer of something more behind it. Maybe she was just trying to make light of something. Or maybe she was more guarded than I realized. I felt like there was so much I wanted to ask. But instead, I just sat down at the edge of her table. I didn't even ask if it was okay. The conversation seemed to flow easily after that, as if we'd known each other for a long time, though we hadn't even exchanged names yet. Her name, she told me, was Claire. I remember how it sounded, soft, like the wind in the trees. She had a laugh that made you feel like you were part of something bigger, something gentle. It was a sound I could hear again and again, and it would always feel like a new discovery. We talked about books, music, the rain outside, and everything in between. Her life felt different from mine in a way I couldn't quite explain. She spoke with an intensity, a depth that pulled me in. I could tell she wasn't someone who spoke just to speak. Everything she said felt thought through, like it came from a place of careful reflection. I remember how the conversation shifted, as if we both knew there was more to say. We started talking about dreams, what we wanted out of life, the places we wanted to visit. She told me about a trip to Paris she'd always dreamed of taking, about how she wanted to see the Eiffel Tower at sunrise. She spoke about it so vividly, I could almost see the early morning light playing over the city. I told her about my own dream. It was less grand, just a little cabin by the sea where I could write, away from all the noise of the world. We laughed about how different our dreams were, but in the same breath I felt like we understood each other completely. As the conversation went on, I found myself thinking less about my usual routine, less about the world outside the cafe. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just going through the motions of life. I was actually present, sharing something real with someone who felt like they could be part of my world, in a way that didn't seem forced or planned. It was like we'd known each other forever, but also like we were just beginning. By the time the rain had stopped, hours had passed. We exchanged numbers without really thinking about it. It was the easiest thing in the world. And yet in that moment, I knew this would change everything. We left the cafe together, walking out into the city, our conversation flowing as if there was no space between us. For the first time, I felt the kind of hope I hadn't known I was missing. I didn't know where it would lead, but I didn't need to. All I knew was that chance had brought us together, and sometimes that was enough to change your life forever. I'll tell you the story of how I met her. It feels like it happened in the blink of an eye, but when I think about it, so much had to fall into place for it to happen. I guess it all started one rainy evening. I had just finished a long, exhausting day at work, the kind of day where nothing seems to go right. I was just mindlessly scrolling through my social media feed, tired of looking at the same old posts when I saw her. She was a friend of a friend, and I clicked on her profile out of sheer boredom. Her name was Emily, simple, sweet. Her profile was just different. It wasn't the usual vacation photos or selfies people post. She had posted a picture of a book she was reading, her coffee cup next to it, a piece of the sunset visible through the window. It was just so genuine, you know? Not trying to impress anyone, just sharing a little piece of her world. It struck me instantly. I wanted to know more about her. So I did the most casual thing I could think of. I sent her a message. I didn't expect a reply. You never really do, right? But then, a few minutes later, my phone buzzed. She had responded. I can't even explain how excited I was, like, just one simple message and suddenly my world felt a little bit brighter. We started talking. At first, it was just small talk, stuff about work, what books we liked, music we were into. We connected over the fact that we were both kind of introverted, both loved to read, and had a deep appreciation for quiet moments. But the more we talked, the more I realized how easy it was to talk to her. It felt like we were on the same wavelength. It became something I looked forward to every day. I would wake up and check my phone first thing in the morning, just to see if she had messaged me. And the evenings were the best. Late night, conversations that would stretch until we both had to force ourselves to sleep. We'd share songs, talk about everything from childhood memories to future dreams. There was this connection I couldn't ignore, something that felt real even though we were miles apart. After a few months of texting and talking online, we made plans to meet. Honestly, I was nervous. I had never met anyone like her. What if we weren't as compatible in real life? What if the chemistry didn't translate outside of the screen? But I couldn't stop myself from wanting to meet her. There was a pull, something undeniable. The day came and I was a mess of nerves. I stood at the park, hands in my pockets, pacing back and forth. The moment I saw her walking toward me, though, all those nerves melted away. She was even more beautiful in person. Her laugh, her smile, everything about her felt like it had been lifted straight from the stories we had shared. "Hi," she said, her voice a little shy, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Hey," I replied, my heart racing. We hugged awkwardly at first, both of us unsure, but as soon as I held her, it just felt right, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We spent the whole day together, talking about everything and nothing. We went to a cafe, sat in a corner, and shared stories about our lives, our families, our fears. We laughed about silly things, The kind of stuff you can only laugh at with someone who truly gets you. It felt so natural, like we had always known each other, but now we were just meeting for the first time. By the end of the day, I knew something was different. I had felt sparks before, but this was more than that. This was comfort. This was knowing that even though we had only just met, it was like we'd been writing our own little love story without even knowing it. Over the next few months, we kept seeing each other, and every time we met, it was like something deeper was unfolding. I learned about her childhood, the way she'd grown up, the dreams she had. She learned about mine. We shared our insecurities, our hopes, the things we feared. And the more I learned, the more I realized that I had never met anyone so perfectly suited to me. There were moments that felt like magic, like when we sat together watching the sunset, our hands brushing but neither of us rushing to make a move, letting the moment stretch out, or the time we went on a random road trip, driving aimlessly for hours, listening to music and sharing secrets until we didn't even know where we were anymore. But it wasn't always easy. Like any relationship, we faced our challenges. There were misunderstandings and differences we had to work through. But somehow, every time we hit a rough patch, it felt like we had the strength to pull through because we were doing it together. There was no me or you. It was always us, and that made everything easier. And you know what? I've come to realize that she's not just the woman I was lucky enough to meet online. She's the one I was meant to find. All the conversations, the long nights, the silly moments, it wasn't just random chance. It was fate. Every text, every call, every laugh, it all led us here. It wasn't a perfect journey, but it was ours. And in the end, that's all that matters. We've been together for a while now. And every day I'm grateful that I swiped through that social media feed, that I sent her that message, and that she decided to reply. Because that one small action brought us together, and I couldn't imagine my life without her now. So yeah, that's how we met. It started online, but it grew into something real, something beautiful, something that's changing my life. And every day I'm still falling in love with her all over again. It was a regular Thursday afternoon, the kind where the world moves in its usual rhythm, people bustling through the streets without thinking too much about where they're headed or why. I was sitting at my usual spot, a corner bench near the small park by the coffee shop, nursing a cold cup of coffee and trying to force myself to focus on the book in front of me. The pages were blurry and my mind kept wandering, as it often did when I had too much time on my hands and not enough to keep me busy. That's when she walked past. I didn't notice her right away. At first, it was just another face in the crowd, another person in the sea of commuters and wanderers. But then something shifted. She had that presence, you know? The kind that feels like the air around her changes. Like she was the one thing in the world that made sense in the chaos of the city. Her hair was dark, almost black. But with sunlight hitting it just right, it shimmered like gold. Her eyes, I swear, were like the sky right before the sunset. Deep and vivid. Full of warmth. And so honest that it made everything else feel smaller. Less significant. She walked slowly, as if she was in no rush. Every step was purposeful, graceful, like she knew exactly where she was headed and yet didn't mind the journey. It felt like she was floating just above the ground. Her movement so fluid it was almost like watching a dream. She paused near a vendor selling flowers, running her fingers over the delicate petals of a daisy before deciding to buy one. And just like that, the world around me faded into the background. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I know it sounds crazy, but it was like time stopped. I wanted to go up to her, to say something, anything, but I was frozen. I kept telling myself that I was being ridiculous, that I didn't know her, that I had no right to feel this way after just one look. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something that made the world feel so much more alive than it had just a moment ago. She turned in my direction, and for the briefest second, our eyes locked. That was all it took. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, and I felt heat rise to my face. I tried to look away, but my body didn't listen. I couldn't. It was like everything in me was drawn to her. Like gravity itself was pulling me closer. She smiled, just a small, knowing smile, but it was enough to make me feel like I was standing on the edge of something impossible, something that could change everything. It wasn't an ordinary smile. It was soft, but there was something behind it, something that told me she felt the same pull, the same electric connection. She walked toward me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel awkward. I didn't feel like I had to hide behind my book or pretend I wasn't nervous. I just sat there watching her approach, The world around me now so quiet, so still, that it was as though only the two of us existed in that moment. When she reached the bench, she didn't say anything right away. She just stood there looking at me for a second. Her gaze was so intense that it almost felt like she was searching for something. Something I didn't know I had to give, but somehow knew she would find. Finally, she spoke. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice soft with just a hint of laughter behind it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. No, of course not," I stammered, suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must have looked. She sat down next to me, close enough that I could smell the faint fragrance of her perfume, something floral, like jasmine, mixed with the scent of the fresh air. It was intoxicating. Neither of us spoke for a while, and yet it didn't feel awkward. The silence between us was comfortable, as if we had known each other for years. I could feel the tension building, though like there was something unsaid, something both of us were waiting for. Finally, she turned to me again, and this time her eyes were brighter, almost sparkling. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice soft but sure. I felt a rush of relief, like she had just given me permission to speak. "I'm Ben," I said, and when I did, I couldn't help but smile. The words felt so right, so perfect. She glanced at the book in my hands and raised an eyebrow. "What's that? Something good?" I glanced down at it as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm not sure anymore. I keep trying to read, but my mind keeps wandering." She smiled again, and it made my heart skip. "You're not the only one," she said, looking around the park. "It's a nice day, isn't it?" "It is. The kind of day you wish would never end," I said before I could stop myself. She nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I know what you mean. Sometimes you just need to stop and appreciate the little things, right? Like a good cup of coffee, or the way the sunlight filters through the trees." I found myself nodding along, completely drawn into the way she spoke, the way her words seemed to flow with such ease. "Exactly," I said, realizing that this moment, this conversation was unlike any I had ever had. It felt natural, unforced. She laughed softly. "I think we're getting a little too poetic, don't you think?" "I don't mind," I said, and it felt like an honest response. "I think it's kind of nice." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned back on the bench, letting the quiet wash over us. The air between us was charged, but not in an uncomfortable way, more like the calm before a storm. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, talking about little things, laughing at silly jokes, and letting the world move on around us. But it was clear to me by then that this was no ordinary encounter. This was something more, something I couldn't quite explain but didn't need to. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, she stood up slowly, her gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer than usual. "It was nice meeting you, Ben," she said, her voice low and sincere. "Yeah," I said, standing up as well, my heart pounding. "It really was." She smiled one last time, a look that told me everything I needed to know. And then she walked away, blending into the crowd, but somehow leaving a part of herself behind with me. I sat there for a long time after she left, still feeling the weight of her presence. I don't know why it happened or what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. This was the start of something incredible. I could feel it in my bones.